But let's go to the next one.
Not always have been threatened in that my head is going to come off at any minute, right? My parents grew up and lived there. They didn't die. But once the Civil War broke out, then it became lethally dangerous to be Jewish. I mean, we were going to be executed. We left. So you never know when we're going to go from tolerating you to off with the heads. And that's been the history for the past 1,400 years.
So pretty much he's talking about we just never know when they're going to flip. We can translate it to like that?
Right.
What do you got to say?
So there's two things with this, really important things that ought to be really stressed. One is that now he's making it as if Muslims are intrinsically violent and that you don't know when they are going to actually become violent. The question is, why would that be your assumption of only Muslims? There are segments of Muslims, we're not denying that there are some Muslims that are prone to violence, that have been violent, that continue to be violent. But is that an exclusively Muslim problem? That's point one. Number two is, whereas once again, your claim is noticeable by its lack of evidence. So in other words, in order to make this claim, where is your evidence from the Quran and Sunnah? Because once again, you're conflating Islam and Muslims. Islam as a religion, there is enough in the religion to make it patently clear to anyone who has a sincere mind and a pure heart and who's receptive to listening to these arguments, that Islam is categorically against the killing of innocent, or let's not even use the word innocent, non-combatant people. Because the word innocent could be said, okay, well, it's subjective. What does the word innocent mean? We are saying non-combatants. And what is the evidence of this? A hadith that is narrated by the Prophet Muhammad, where it says, "Man qatala mu'ahidan lam yarih ra'ihat al-jannah." Whoever kills a non-combatant, non-Muslim will never smell the fragrance of heaven. Why have I translated it as non-combatant, non-Muslim? Because this hadith, which is in Bukhari, is a sahih hadith, authentic, has been narrated upon by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, one of the scholars of Islam, major scholars who wrote Fath al-Bari, one of the major commentaries. Probably the best to have written about the Bukhari, this collection, the most authoritative book of hadith according to Sunni Muslims. He says a mu'ahad here in this hadith means a dhimmi, it means a mu'ahad al-musta'min. So in other words, any non-Muslim who is a non-combatant. That's the summary. So if the Prophet is telling us that you will never smell the fragrance of paradise if you attempt to murder, or if you murder a non-combatant non-Muslim, and this man is saying Muslims are prone to violence, and he's indicating that potentially that violence comes from the Islamic sources, then does that not run counter to this particular hadith? Not regarding, of course, the Quran, what it says in chapter 60, verse 8. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين. That Allah does not forbid you of being nice and kind to those non-believers who do not take you out of your homes or try and kill you. And that certainly Allah loves those who are just. This particular verse in the Quran is not abrogated. No scholar has said it's abrogated. No mufassir, no exegete applying the hermeneutical approach has said that this verse is abrogated. Therefore, with this verse and this hadith, and of course the many other verses in the Quran like 532, chapter 5 verse 32 and other verses, it's categorically clear that the Islamic position is that it is not allowed for a Muslim to endanger or kill or murder a non-Muslim who is a non-combatant. In any case, this runs counter to this man's claim.
Now, any other verses that are mentioned in the verbatim word of God, the Quran, where we have intact, tamper-free, tamper-proof,
yes,
as we had it revealed over 1,400 years ago, we have it. Mm-hmm. There's no other book like it.
Yeah.
There are references in there,
mm-hmm,
and there's verses that people will take a lot of times out of context. So how do you now, for the skeptic, maybe Joe or one of his followers, they say, well, what about
those verses? Those verses.
How do you read those, interpret those verses?
Well, there's two things that need to be looked at. We are not denying. Well, first of all, Muslim position is not a pacifistic one, and that has to be made patently clear. That Islam is not a religion of pacifism. In other words, we do believe that there is a scope, an international scope from an international perspective, an international relations perspective, for defensive, and sometimes historically there have been preemptive excursions, and that's happened. There's been campaigns. We're not saying that didn't happen, and we wouldn't deny that happened. That did happen. That is part of the Islamic corpus. There are verses in the Quran which encourage, in the context of war, for aggression. There is, for example, in chapter 8, verse number 12 and 13, it says, سألقي في قلوب الذين كفروا الرعب فاضربوا فوق الأعناق واضربوا منهم من كل بنان, which is very much parroted by a lot of these Islamophobes, which says that I will put in the hearts of the disbelievers terror, so hit them at the necks and hit them at the fingertips. What is this talking about? It's very, very clear that chapter 8 of the Quran, chapter 9, chapter 4, chapter 2, all those places and those places in the Quran which talk about violence reference the context of war.
War. This is combat now.
Only combat. And do you know what the evidence of this is? And this is something which, unfortunately, and this man is meant to be an Arab, but I don't think he's familiar with these things. I will challenge anyone actually on this. Yeah, there is no place in the Quran where the word, where killing is mentioned, of someone who's a non-Muslim, without at least the beginning of that particular segment a reference to qital being made. Now the word qital in Arabic, it necessitates fighting from both sides. It has to have fighting from both sides. Qital means fighting from both sides. Whenever the Quran mentions fighting or killing, it only does so when it's clear that the one who you're fighting is a combatant that is intending to endanger you and endanger your life and endanger your property. Not in the context where that person is a non-combatant. That is clear in the linguistic, what you would call the meter. This is called the meter, the Arabic meter of this particular word. Qital, it cannot mean one person murdering another person who is a non-combatant. It necessitates in the Arabic language that there is fighting from both sides. So everywhere in the Quran which talks about fighting only does so in the context of war. And this is absolutely non-controversial, considering that is the foreign policy of almost every, if not every country in the world today. It's absolutely not controversial. But they've made it controversial because they need to stigmatize the other, and today the other is the Muslim.